When I'm picking the phone up to people who are ringing me for advice on maybe a car they've seen advertised privately, is almost a sense of panic buying, and that feeling that they don't want to be the sort of Wally in the pub with his mates that doesn't have a classic car in his garage at home. And what I say to those people over and over again is just slow down, wait, get the right car. So what we're seeing now, as a result of these enormous increase in values over the last decade, is cars that I was seeing 10, 12, 15 years ago, and we were rejecting and saying that they're not good enough to restore. They've been repaired badly, they've lost their integrity, restored 2 or 3 times, rejecting those cars. Of course, now those cars are being got at and repaired and often being made to look, as we say in this business, 5-yard pretty. This is the first generation Michelin Trx tyre. So if you see that tread pattern, be prepared for a large bill. Trx tyres now, tricky to get hold of, £350 each plus VAT. And that hasn't been produced for over 20 years. So you're looking for the newer Trx GT. The Michelin Trx tyre was, in fairness, a criticism of the M6 from brand new. Even on these later GT version of the TRX, they're still a noisy tyre, they're still quite tramliney, highly expensive, and that's why a lot of owners will probably want to consider at some point getting off these 415mm rims, which of course restrict tyre purchases to only this TRX tyre, and onto a 17-inch Imperial rim, where you would probably choose a nice original 17-inch Alpina or possibly a BBS split rim. Front wing problems on 6 Series were evident by the time these cars were about 10 years old, with corrosion breaking through the forward section of the front wings here. The wings today are about £600 plus VAT each. And as you can see on this example, often appallingly repaired to save purchasing new wings. You can see here the terrible panel gap and the dreadful line along the top of the front bumper there. And to be honest, you can tell straight away that the lower section of that front wing is entirely filler. Corrosion in rear quarters and arches on 6s is a serious problem. The double skinning here between the outer wing return and the inner wheel housing and the spot welds, of course we end up with swollen seams, and you need to work all the way around the arch and feel very carefully for those swellings. On this example you can see behind the M-Technic sill skirt here, actually the bottom of the arch is completely rotted away. I mean, the best repair of course is to replace the rear wing, but most, because they were done on a budget when values were less, of course have had repair sections let in. You need to look behind the airbox and the washer bottle at E24 inner front wings, where you can see the seam, the vertical seam between front panel and inner wing is a real problem area and corrodes out. And on the inner wing here, you can see on this car a rather nasty big patch welded to the inner wing, and that's actually the front bumper side mounting support, where it's spot welded onto the inner wing, has completely rotted out and taken the inner wing with it, and that's the sort of repair we just do not want to see. Have a close look at the front turrets on your M6. Often, like this example, you can see they've been domed. You'll see the studs for the top mount here have flared out. 2 causes: might have mounted a curb, hit a curb hard, or in this case seized front bilsteins, causing impact up through the top mount and, as I said, doming that turret over. It's a myth that the M635 had a heavy clutch. It shouldn't be. When you depress the pedal, it shouldn't take a huge amount of effort. If it does, you're going to have to look at replacing the clutch, because if you don't, that can lead on to clutch release bearing failure, and that can be expensive. It'll damage motronic sensors here and possibly the flywheel also. The Trx 280 is a strong gearbox, but did actually suffer from slightly noisy lay shaft bearings even when it was brand new. If when sitting in neutral you find that the lay shaft bearing, the clatter is loud, at some point that gearbox is going to have to be taken apart and new bearings and synchros. They're a little bit tricky, the 280, to rebuild, so it will be a bit costly. Rear gearbox oil seals leaking, very, very, very common actually on all Getrag boxes, and that will cause oil contamination into the rear gearbox mountings, which can also split anyway. And then you need to look at prop shaft as well. The prop shaft coupling there, the prop shaft bearing is often weak, causing shudder when pulling away. All E24s suffer from leaking fuel tanks, and on this car here you can see the staining where the fuel's been washing down. They only actually leak when the fuel tank's full, and in the neck of the tank there's 3 very small delicate pipes which are all part of the venting system for the fuel tank, and they rot off. You can tell if a fuel tank's been changed because if it hasn't got the drain bung like this tank, you know it's a new tank, so that tells you straight away this tank has never been replaced. That and the staining. You'll find many M6s, because of the cost of replacement genuine BMW exhaust systems, now have stainless steel systems on, and often those don't sound that great. You can see here this is on borrowed time due to the outer skin of the exhaust box already having rotted away, so it won't be long before that wants replacing. The limited slip differential is actually pretty much bomb-proof. But do bear in mind, you know, I mean, they're 30 years old, so a set of seals to stop oil leaks would be a good preventive maintenance measure. The diff mount, often in this case perished and collapsed, will need replacing. Again, that's age related. Front to rear fuel and brake pipes want a very, very close look at, and all above the rear subframe there. You can see these are heavily corroded, and actually, although the actual parts aren't very expensive, the labour, it's incredibly time consuming, and undoing every single one of these little mountings that hold them to the floor, you can almost guarantee every single one of those will snap off. The one thing that does slightly date these cars is actually the brakes, which a car with 286 horsepower, they do feel slightly dated now with a slightly wooden feel. They're also a bit of a problem. The 4-pot calipers, with the little use these cars now see, often the pistons seize up, and often the pistons are corroded, making rebuilding the calipers tricky. So that does beg the question whether that makes a good time to change over to a later Brembo caliper, which will give a better pedal as well, and just more reliable. So higher mileage cars, the steering may feel slightly vague now, and we find ourselves more and more having to take the ZF steering box off and rebuilding it and resetting the preload to make the centre position feel more positive. But that vague feeling is then exaggerated by often this small bracket here from the front subframe to the steering box being cracked, and we have to often repair those, and actually we put a little reinforcing bracket in to ensure that it doesn't happen again. Cracked front engine mounts are a problem. Check the metal cage for the rubber engine mounting there, and as you'll see there's a terrific amount of ball joints and bushes on the front suspension and steering of all E24s, and they're the same whether it's 635 or M6. And bear in mind it's expensive to replace every single suspension arm, track rod, steering idler bush, etc., roll bar dive links, and it all adds up to sort of quite a vague feeling. So bushes perished, ball joint gaiters perished, plain ball joints, all of those things need checking, and as I said, it is quite expensive to replace all the suspension links and all the steering arms. So one needs to take a close look at the rear suspension. Bear in mind all the Bilstein shock absorbers are now sort of 30 plus years old. They can actually be rebuilt and revalved if necessary, but they, as I said, they are all 30 years old. We're on a close look at suspension bushes, rear subframe bushes, pitman arms, perished trailing arm bushes. Have a close look at brake flexes. That one is actually like concrete, and have a look for bulges also. A normal problem area is these damaged front towing eyes, which are welded onto the front of the chassis legs here, and you can see these have been jacked up on and damaged and dented, and actually often you'll see where they've actually been driven into curbs and bent right back and crushed. On the front floors here and at the sort of bottom of the A-pillar area, you'll see these square pads, and these are actually lifting pads. Unfortunately, they look like they should be used, but they're actually designed for moving body shells around Carmen when they were being built. once jacked on, they're not very strong. They get crushed and damaged, and then the product splits, water gets in there, and they rot out. And then unfortunately, so often they get lost and the floor pan's rather badly repaired. So on this rather terrible E24 shell here, we see this rather nasty welded in patch to the front floor here, where it's been corroded, and actually those square lifting pads completely missing, where someone hasn't done the fabrication correctly or well. So often the sill returns here, where inner sill spot welds onto outer sill, has been damaged, often by ramp legs over the years, and bent, and again the product split, and then corrosion setting in. And here we can see terrible corrosion again in that double skinning between outer and inner sill, and this one is bleeding terribly. It actually wants the whole inner and outer sill section completely cutting out. Here at the back, this is a real Achilles heel area around the rear subframe mounting on the back of the sill, and again this has had an enormous patch plate sort of appallingly welded in there into the back of the inner sill there. A nasty job. Take a close look at all the body plugs, both in the floor pans and the spare wheel well here. Often serious corrosion around the body plugs, especially in the floors. And then you can see here a very, very corroded rear towing eye. That will need completely removing, and a new towing eye welding onto the boot floor. You need to look up behind this spare wheel well, up in the depths of the rear panel and the seams to the inner wings here, which again suffer from serious corrosion. That's the seams from the rear panel to the rear quarters. Outer sills want looking at very closely, especially where the jacking points are spot welded onto the outer sill. Again, that's another weak area where moisture gets behind the jacking point and then rots into the actual outer sill itself. On cars with M-Technic kit fitted, like this example here, we would strongly recommend at some point getting this M-Technic kit off the car and having a close look at the outer sills behind. Be suspicious of cars with sort of poor running, lumpy idle. Airflow meters are getting old now, and sometimes we can recalibrate them, but in some cases the only way to get your hydrocarbons down and your CO right is to replace an airflow meter, which is over £500. Under the engine bay, you want to have a good look and a feel of whether an M635 is up to date with the preventive maintenance. Has it had coolant hoses? They're all 30 years old. Has it had fuel hoses replaced? Is there play in the water pump? Throttle cables want replacing as preventive maintenance. Leaking brake sphere pressure switches. But a lot of these things are, sort of generic things you'd look at when they're buying any 30-year-old car. You need to take a close look at the roof. Sunroof panels often, the actual panel itself often does have corrosion, and get it open and have a look up inside. That's not the end of the world. You can replace just the sunroof panel. However, if you see signs of bubbling or corrosion coming through on the actual roof itself, you've got a big bill, and it's a tricky repair putting roof corrosion right. Be cautious. The design of the E24 means water does pool in the front corners of the screen seals here, and you can actually see it's creeping into the lamination on this screen, so that's going to want a new screen, and obviously a new screen seal, because again that will be like concrete and 30 years old. But leaks to the inside of the car are a serious E24 problem, not just from leaking screen seals here, which then fill the ECU up, the Motronic ECU, and cause water damage to that, but also the sunroof drain tubes block and water runs down the pillar and fills your footwells up with water. Take a close look at the brightwork: grills, bumpers, trims, side mouldings, gutter mouldings, screen trims. People often underestimate the high cost of brightwork and also the labour involved in stripping and fitting it. Whether it's a Highline or an early bumpered car, just the labour to take a front bumper apart and put it back together with new brightwork could easily add up to half a day to a day's labour. You need to take a very, very close look at the paintwork on a E24. The cost of respraying an E24 is high. Remember, they're a hand-built car by Carman. The strip and fit time to do it properly, that's glass out, trim off, it's a time-consuming job. I mean, removing and refitting gutter mouldings can be a day's labour in itself. So often, because of the low values of 10 years ago, resprays were done to a very, very low standard, and then you worry what's hidden underneath. This one has been done more recently, and we can see all these micro blisters coming through here, and that's moisture trapped underneath the paint. Only 524 right-hand drive M635s were built. We've seen them all, more than most, either end of the spectrum, from the very worst to the very best, and everything in between. The best advice I can give you is put as much money into the initial purchase, buy the best you can possibly afford. It's always cheaper in the long run.